Hi everybody, Peggy McGuire here with English 106, and today's topic is on making oral presentations based on business research. So at this point you have proposed a research project, your proposal has been accepted, you have carried out the research you needed to do, you've analyzed the results of that research, you have written a report that tells your reader what you did and what you learned through your research. And now, for a variety of reasons, you may be asked to make a presentation of the information that you contained in that written report. So today we talk about how you do that. First, the question why? Why make oral presentations? In general, you make an oral presentation to persuade people to care about something that you believe in. In this case, something that you've worked very hard on. You've really thought about a question. You've done the research you needed to inform your thinking, and you've made decisions and recommendations, and now you want to persuade other people that the recommendations you're making are sound and they ought to take. So if that is the why, then the how is that an effective oral presentation of this kind of information will be well delivered. It will take an approach that fits the audience and purpose. It will include good content. It'll be well organized, and it will include visuals. And a little hint here, if you have done a good job of writing your research report, then other than the first bullet, the other bullets really take care of themselves if you've done the work you needed to get to a good written report. The delivery is what will set us apart here, and we'll talk in a bit about some specific issues related to delivery that you want to be aware of. But the fact is that whether or not you're writing or you're speaking in this kind of business environment, there are some things that are always going to be true. In order for your message to be effective, you need to be able to adapt it to your target audience. Again, who are you trying to reach? Who are you trying to persuade? Who are you trying to inform? What do you know about the audience that will help you form your message so that it reaches them most effectively? So that ability to adapt based on who you're talking to is critical in both written and oral communication of this kind. In both written and oral forms, you need to show that audience that you've identified specifically how they will benefit from whatever it is you are trying to persuade them to do. So is it an idea you want them to adopt? Is it a policy you want them to enact? A decision to be made? A product to buy? A service that they need? How will your audience benefit from whatever it is that you are trying to persuade them to take or do? Okay? Also, in both written and oral communication of this kind, you need to think about what might be the objections raised by my audience, and then think about them beforehand so that you can also plan a strategy for overcoming them. Because you want to be able to overcome any objections that you imagine the audience might have to what you are trying to persuade them to do. The you attitude, the positive emphasis, is important in both forms. Using visuals to clarify and emphasize your main points is important both in the written and oral version of your message. And that action step, the piece where you say clearly what you want your audience to do next, needs to be clear whether or not you're writing or you're speaking. However, having said that about both forms of communication, there are some things that oral presentations allow you to do that a written presentation would not. First of all, you have the people right in front of you, so it's much easier to use emotion to help persuade those people. They are much more likely to respond to what you're saying if they're right in front of you with some kind of an emotional reaction than they will be reading text that you've written. You're able to focus your audience's attention on particular points by body language, by the visuals you use, by the language you use when they are in front of you, as opposed to the fact that you really have very little control over how people read and what they pay most attention to. So you can use the oral environment to really help focus the audience on what you want them to focus on. Because they're right in front of you, you can answer their questions, you can resolve any conflicts that they raise, and you can try to build consensus to get everybody to agree, everybody in the room now to agree, or at least say, I can live with this together right now as a group. The other nice thing you can do in an oral environment that you can't do in a written one is that you can right on the spot modify a proposal or an idea that you're putting out there that you're realizing the audience is finding unacceptable in its current form. So because they're in front of you, you can see how they're responding. And if you can clearly see that folks are not happy, then if you choose to, and if it's appropriate, you can right on the spot modify what you're saying, whether it's a proposal or an idea that you've put out there. And in the same way, because they're right in front of you, you can get an immediate action or an immediate response from people. You can say, I'd like you right now to write down 2 ways that you are going to implement this information that I've just given you. You can get them to actually do something right there that would make it more likely that they will go ahead and take the action you want them to take, or respond in the way you want them to respond. All right, so let's look a little more closely at oral presentations. And once again, I start by ways that they are very similar to written presentations of business information. There are 3 related purposes that we always bring to oral presentation. If our primary purpose is to teach people something or to train them how to do something, then our primary purpose is to inform. We're really informing. Probably more often, while we are informing, we are also trying people to persuade them to do something. So, are we trying to get them to make a vote or a decision that we like? Or are we trying to get them to change their behaviors or their attitudes? Or are we trying to reinforce an existing behavior or attitude? So those are various ways that our purpose in oral presentations is a persuasive purpose. And then always building goodwill. We are trying to make people go out the door feeling good about the experience. So, does that mean we're going to spend a little time entertaining them? Are we going to say things that help them feel good about themselves? Are we going to affirm the work that they do? You have to find some way to reach out to that audience and help them to feel good about being there. One thing that drives everything else in an oral presentation is your own statement of your purpose. What am I trying to achieve by making this oral presentation? That purpose statement that you make to yourself will guide every other choice you make about how you put together an oral presentation. So I would suggest you actually write it down, and write it down as specifically as possible for your particular presentation. Here is what I want to accomplish in this presentation. Write it down and then use it literally as a guide for everything you do after that. So, just as if we were talking about a written product, we are going to start in an oral product by talking about planning. Because as with writing, if you do a good enough job of your planning, you have half the battle is won. So the first thing when in an oral presentation, the first thing that comes into your planning is to simplify your message. When you are speaking to people, they have limited attention spans. They want to know what's the most important thing you have to say. So your job is to get to that one big idea that you want your audience to take away from this oral presentation. In most cases, if you're doing the kind of research that you're doing for this course, that one big idea is going to be the recommendation or multiple recommendations that you're making to people. That's going to be the one big thing you want them to take away. What do you recommend they do next? Okay? So, that's your big idea. Simplify it. Get it clear as humanly possible in your mind and clearly communicated to your audience. Along with that one big idea, you want to choose what are the most essential details to support my idea. You want visuals that people can take in and understand at one glance. If I have to spend any amount of time looking at your visual in order to understand it, it's not working. You want the visual to be so communicative that I can look at it and get it right away. So that's your choice process. Choosing visuals that will send that message loud and clear quickly with that one glance. And then making sure that the words and sentences you choose are clear and easy to understand. Right? You don't want to confuse listeners with a lot of vague, wordy, long sentences. You want things to be clear and easy to understand. Now, let's think about different ways you can actually present information in an oral presentation. And there are 3 primary ways to do it. Each one has a different feel and has a different relationship built with your audience. So first of all, you can do what I am doing here today because I have no other choice, and that is to do a monologue. I am talking without interruption. And you can, in an oral presentation, talk without interruption, but you must, in that oral environment, then at the end, make time for questions. All right? So in other words, you're not going to ask people to ask questions throughout your presentation, but you will make sure there's time at the end for them to ask questions. So that would be the monologue approach. Another approach is what we call guided discussion. And that means before you ever even do your presentation, you think about with the audience what questions they would most likely want to ask. And you actually agree with your audience on a set of questions that will be dealt with during the presentation. As I said, this is a different relationship you're establishing with your audience because you're right up front asking your audience to share their own knowledge with you and with the whole group, as well as your expertise. So you really are building a relationship that says, my audience is important. Their knowledge is important to this conversation. So it really does become more like a conversation because the audience has had some input into what kind of questions will be dealt with during the oral presentation. And then the most sort of free-flowing and hardest to plan, by the way, kind of presentation is what we call an interactive presentation. And that really doesn't look so much like a presentation as it does like a conversation between you and your audience. So that might look like you, instead of talking a lot, it would be asking a lot of questions. You as the presenter would be asking questions, and the audience would do a lot of the talking. Again, that it's highly interactive. It's very engaging. The audience really is highly involved in the presentation, but it also means that you really have so much less control over what happens during the presentation as you would in the other 2 modes, especially the monologue where you have the greatest amount of control. But really, you're leaving it wide open to whatever happens. And that can be a wonderful experience if it's appropriate to your topic, to what you're trying to accomplish, to your purpose statement. If it's appropriate to have that level of interaction with the audience, it can be a wonderful, rich, informative experience. But it's one that you really need to guide carefully without really knowing for sure what's going to happen. So it makes life very interesting. So you're thinking about your audience, you're thinking about which approach is going to work best with this audience and with my purpose. And then you're going to ask yourself some practical questions that the audience might have of you. If you're asking them to buy something or to try a new process or something like that, one of the questions they're probably going to have is, will this work? Is this something that's actually feasible? Will it work? And as is often, almost always the case in a business environment, how much will it cost? How long will it take? Time and money. What is going to be the expense here in terms of my time and my financial resources that go right along with, will this in fact work? All right. So make sure you've thought about those questions beforehand and you're ready to answer them. Of course, in your oral presentation, what you want to do is focus on the parts of the message that will be most interesting and easiest to accept. That's where you want to spend most of your time because that's where you're going to get the most positive feedback from your audience. And one way to do that is to show very clearly how your ideas will directly affect your audience, or at least how it connects to their interests and their experiences. So make it interesting, make it meaningful, make it on time for the audience. That's how you keep them interested and keep them more likely to accept what you are asking them to accept. So, I've got all this information about the project that I've done. Now, I know I can't use it all in an oral presentation. I know my job is to boil things down to one clear message and the most essential information to support that message. So, how do I choose what information to use and what information to not use in this oral report? I will not tell them everything that's in the report. I just won't. But I will get at what is the most interesting information to them. That I'll make sure to communicate. What will answer their most likely questions? That's because I thought ahead of time about what those questions are likely to be. What information do I have that will be most persuasive? Do these people like statistics? Do statistics make them feel like I really know what I'm talking about? Or do they like things to be demonstrated? Do they like to see a lot of visuals that show them what something looks like and how it works? These are things you need to know by knowing your audience. What is going to best persuade this particular audience? What are my main points? How do those points relate to each other? Here we go again with visuals. What visuals can I use to best illustrate my points in an entertaining, engaging way? Is it pictures? Do I use props? Do I give stuff out? Little tokens, little mementos? Whatever it is that's going to actually get people visually interested in what you're talking about. How can I use this opportunity to tell a story about the project and about the work that was done and about the meaningfulness of the question that we're trying to answer? How do I set the scene? How do I define the problem? How do I let the action unfold that gets us to solving that problem? And then a very practical matter, do I need to provide handouts? Do people need to have something in their hands to follow along with as I speak? Or do they need graphics to be able to give them a pictorial sense of what I'm saying to go along with what they're hearing as I speak? So do I need to give stuff out for people to have while I speak? All right. So I've answered all those questions. I've made all those decisions. Now I'm going to organize the information into the actual presentation. So first thing to think about, planning a strong opening. The opening of a presentation is the most important part of the presentation because that's where you grab the audience's attention or you don't. And you need to have your audience's attention right from the beginning if you're going to keep them. Because like I said, people have limited attention spans. People get tired. They get hungry. They get distracted easily. So you need to grab them from the beginning. So the opening needs to be strong. So how can you do that? You could try to make some sort of personalizing statement. Something recently that happened that relates to your topic and that they would be familiar with. Some local event that has happened or is going to happen that's relevant to your message. Some reference to people that you think that they would know that has to do with your message. Make some kind of a startling statement, something that surprises people or that they're not expecting. Tell a story. Stories are wonderful. People like stories. Quote some relevant famous person. Or, one of my favorites is actually ask a question that requires an immediate reply or action from the audience. So at the very beginning, you're engaging the audience literally by making them answer a question or do something as a way to open up and get their attention. Okay, so we got your opening. Now the body. The way I structure the body is so that it's absolutely clear to the audience where you're going. And we have several organizational patterns that can get you there. And we've talked several of these before. We've talked about, and this all depends on your content. It all depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you are trying to get people to do something that is the result of a series of events that have happened over time, then you might just order the body of your presentation in chronological order. First this happened, then this, then this, then that, and now we're here. And here's what we have to do. Or if you're in problem-solving mode, you organize your presentation by presenting the problem, by presenting the causes of the problem, and then proposing the solution to the problem. The exclude alternatives we've spoken about before. You put out the problem, and then you talk about several different ways it could be solved, but you take each one and you talk about why it won't work until you get the one that you actually want your audience to accept. The pro-con, we've talked about that before. You put out an alternative answer to the question or solution to the problem, and you say what are its strengths, what are its weaknesses, and then you end up by saying which one is the best alternative. Okay? Just numerical ordering of information. First, this is true. Second, this is true. Third, this is true. And based on that, here's what we recommend. So, you choose based on your context and your content. And then, conclusion. Again, this should sound familiar because it's not really all that different from writing the report. Strong opening, good body where you've got the critical information, and now strong conclusion. And you can do one or more of the following in your strong conclusion. You can restate your main point. You can refer back to your opening, however you decided to do that strong opening. You could base your recommendations on a vivid and positive picture of the future that will happen if your recommendations are accepted. Or you could be telling the audience exactly what they need to do to solve the problem that you've been discussing. All right, so some combination of those things is what happens in your conclusion. Remembering you never, ever, ever present new information into that conclusion. Your conclusion is about summarizing, wrapping it up, and leaving them smiling. Now, Another practical piece. If you use PowerPoint slides, which in many, many, many cases you will, because you need those visuals. If you're going to develop PowerPoint slides to go with your oral presentation, make sure that the background and the art on those slides are relevant and appropriate to your topic. We talked earlier about being entertaining, and yes, you want to engage your audience with the visuals you use on PowerPoint slides, but you don't want them to be silly, inappropriate, or heaven forbid, offensive to anyone. So, relevant, appropriate. On PowerPoint slides, almost always, you use words and phrases. You do not use sentences. All right? Lots of bullet lists and numbered lists. Make sure the font is large enough to read from a distance. And in fact, I strongly suggest that before you ever do a presentation for a group, that you get into the room before people start coming, you put up your PowerPoint, and you walk to the back of the room to make sure that you can easily read the text on those slides from the back of the room. So do that test so you don't end up having people squinting and looking uncomfortable and getting distracted by the fact that they can't read your slides. Okay? And for heaven's sake, check each slide for errors. There's nothing more embarrassing, at least I find few things more embarrassing than grammatical errors or punctuation errors on a PowerPoint slide. I have done it, I will admit it, but it's embarrassing. When it gets up there, everybody's looking at it and you realize that there's a really dumb spelling error up there. Don't be embarrassed like I've been. Check your slides and make sure that they're clean. So, you got your content, you got your PowerPoint. Now, what do you actually do as you are presenting your information? Here's the do. Do look directly at the people you're speaking to. And look at individuals in different parts of your audience. That, at least in our Western culture, for most of the situations in which you're going to be in, that eye contact is critical to keeping your audience interested. And you gotta look at people. And you have to look at individuals within the group. All right? So just practice doing that. Get some friends together and practice. But you really need to make that eye contact. A big don't is don't stare at any notes that you might have with you or a device screen on which you might have information. Don't ever stare at that. At best, if you're going to have them in your hands, glance at them when you need to, but don't ever stare at what's in your hands. Okay? Back to do's. Project your voice to the extent it's possible. Not all rooms are going to have microphones. And in fact, using a microphone can be tricky and sometimes almost comical. So unless you feel really comfortable using a microphone, you really do want to practice projecting your voice so that it's easy to hear. Enunciate your words. Pay attention to your tone and your pitch. Your goal is to do a presentation that sounds cheerful, energetic, enthusiastic, confident, as well as being appropriate to whatever situation you're in. You want to come across sounding like you know what you're talking about. And you want to have that audience benefit. You want your audience to feel good about what they're hearing. So, energy, enthusiasm, confidence, those are the things you want to project. Here's something that people don't often think about, but it really does make a difference. And that's how you stand. If you, especially if you're not used to giving presentations in front of people and you need to stand up, it really helps for you to balance your body so that you feel comfortable in your body as you're standing there. You want to be balanced on your 2 feet. All right? You want to feel your center of gravity, and you want to feel comfortably standing on both of your feet. And actually, there is nothing wrong with walking around if you want to do that. Right? if that, just make sure you don't like walk in front of a screen, or, because again, that's mostly, people will just laugh. It's not the end of the world, but it can still feel pretty embarrassing, and it might throw you for a loop if you're not feeling all that comfortable to begin with. So if you're going to walk around, by all means do so, but just be aware of where you're doing it. If you plan to use gestures, do it. Make them big, make them confident. You don't want nervous, ticky kind of gestures. You want to use your arms, use your hands in a way that exudes that kind of confidence and energy and enthusiasm. Now we're back to sort of the notes or the handheld devices. If you need them, okay. But what I suggest is you can put them on a handheld device, but just as easy, put them on index cards. They're much easier to manage, and you look at them infrequently. Again, you don't stare at them. You glance at them now and then. You should know your information well enough to not have to read from them. You never read directly from notes or note cards or a device. Never. You've got to practice, and you've got to know your information well enough that the worst you need to do is look at your notes now and then to remind yourself. Yeah, and here, next one, as I said, if you're using visuals, don't block the screen. Always stand facing the audience. You can, what I often do, you can turn slightly now and then and look up at the screen and gesture toward it to draw people's attention to the words up there if you think that's important. But you never fully stand with your back to an audience, ever. All right? Mostly you are facing the audience or just slightly turning for a brief amount of time to draw people's attention to the screen. Okay? And all of this comes down to practice, practice, practice. Knowing your information and practicing your delivery of that information is going to make your life so much easier. I promise you. All right, questions. Do not ignore questions. If you want your audience to have that goodwill going on, you will let them ask questions. All right. So how do you handle that? First of all, as I've suggested before, you think about this before you come into the room, before you even plan or as part of planning the presentation itself. List every fact or every opinion you can think of that people might come up with to challenge your position. And then plan an answer for each. So you're actually sort of making yourself a list of Q&A before you ever walk into the room to do the presentation. And you're ready. And I've also said this earlier when we talked about modes of presentation. Tell your audience at the beginning how you want to handle questions. So, is it okay to ask me a question anytime during my presentation? If so, say so. Do you want to speak in an interrupted manner and thereby wait for questions at the end? And so do you want people to hold their questions to the end? If that's what you want, you may suggest that they jot them down as they arise, because there's nothing more frustrating for an audience to have questions and either forget what they were or not have time to ask them. So just jotting them down when they come to you, but then holding it to the end, and making sure that you have left time for those questions. You can go either way. It's up to you. When someone asks you a question, look directly at the person asking you the question. Okay? That's really important. Give that sense that you are listening, that you are paying attention, that you fully understand the question being asked. All right? So that's who you look at when the question is being asked. But when you answer the question, the answer is not just for the person who asked, but the answer is for the whole audience. So when you answer the question, you broaden your focus and look at the whole audience, not just the person asking. I do like, in the course of answering a question, to go back and make eye contact with the questioner as a gesture of respect, really, to say, see, I'm answering your question. I paid attention and I'm honoring your question. But for most of that answer, you're looking at the whole audience, not just the person who asked the question. Another way that you engage, you really bring your audience in and keep them with you. Especially with a large group or in a large room, it may be that someone may not hear a question be asked. So it's always a good idea for the speaker, for you, the presenter, to repeat the question that was asked before you answer it. And, especially important, if the question sounds sort of hostile, if the person asking it sounds angry, and the words came out sounding sort of like judgmental or offensive, what you want to do is to try, and this is tough because you're right in the moment, but try to rephrase the question in a way that that still asks the question, but does it in a way that brings the audience back to the benefits of what you're describing, that makes it sound like something positive and forward looking rather than angry. It's hard. It's not easy to do, but it establishes a much greater likelihood that your audience is going to support you as opposed to a hostile questioner. Okay? Now, what if you don't know the answer to a question? That's okay. It's all right to say, I don't know the answer to that right now. As long as you then immediately put out an alternative for getting the answer to the question. So, one of the things you can do is you could say, all right, I'm going to write down that question. I'm going to find the answer as soon as I can after we're done here, and I'm going to make sure you all get it. Okay, that's one. Very confidently, very respectfully. It's okay that you don't know it right now, but I will get you that information. Then your audience will trust you to follow through. So that's one way to do it. Another thing you could do is you could say, I don't know the answer to that. Let's see if anyone else in the audience knows before we move forward. Does anybody in the audience know how to answer that question? Or, if there are specific people in the room who you know will know the answer to that question, then simply refer the question to those people, to that person. So one of those three ways of handling questions you don't know will work without you losing any credibility. Just don't be afraid to say you don't know the answer right now, and here's what we're going to do about it. Okay? So, after your questions are completed, you've given X amount of time for questions, time's up, people are satisfied, you then take 2 more minutes to summarize the main points you made one last time, and you're done. Now, what I've been talking about so far pretty much assumes an individual presenter. Let's talk for a minute about a group making a presentation. All of what I said is still relevant to the individuals making the oral presentation. But in a group, you're going to have multiple people, probably, making parts of the presentation. So each of them has to follow those individual guidelines we've been talking about. But as a group, there are also some extra things they need to take care of. First of all, when you've got a group, it's a good idea to not just think through the organization of your presentation, but to actually outline it so that each of you has a copy of an outline of the presentation. Because once you have that outline, then you can literally divide up the pieces of the outline among the group members. So once you have, introduction, body, conclusion, you can say, okay, who's going to do which part? Okay? So, and you could do this in lots of different ways. You could, for instance, have one person doing the opening and closing, another person presenting the problem, and a third person presenting your proposed solutions. That's just one of many ways that you could divide up. But you want to divide up the responsibilities. And when it gets time for questions, when people ask questions, if people ask if someone asks a question to a particular group member, that group member needs to answer the question. Or if an audience member asks a question about a particular topic, then the person on the team who presented, who covered that topic, needs to be the one to answer the question. All right, so basically, to the extent possible, you are answering from your own area of expertise. So you all have to listen carefully to the questions to figure out who addressed that in our presentation. So who should answer that question? Then, when making a presentation as a group, make sure that you plan transitions from one section of your presentation to another. It's a sort of handoff from one member to the next. And that can be as simple as, okay, I've told you, given you a summary of the problem that we've been researching. Now, Jane here is going to start telling you about the actual research we did. And then Jane talks about the research and then says, so that's what we learned. And now I'm going to turn it over to Joe, who's going to tell you what we recommend based on what we learned. So we're just talking about using language to hand off the different parts of the presentation to one to another. It just makes for a really nice, smooth sense that the group is cohesive and knows what you're doing, and it's just a nice whole. It's not a bunch of jagged pieces. This presentation is a whole. And that's one important way to do it. Make sure before you do your presentation that you check with each other to go over the pieces that each of you are doing, to make sure that you're not either repeating information that somebody already has planned to say, or even worse, that you end up contradicting each other. So you really need to take time to practice before you do a presentation, if for no other reason, to make sure that you're not repeating each other or you're not contradicting each other. All right. Now, I talked about coordination of the information within your presentation. You also have to coordinate your visuals. So make sure if 3 different people are offering visuals for this presentation, make sure that at the end of the day, you still feel like you have one whole presentation and not a bunch of visuals that don't have any relationship to each other. All right, so that sense of wholeness needs to be with your visuals as well as the words and the information that you are communicating. Again, this all comes down to practice, not just individually, but practice as a group. And when you're actually standing in front of the audience and doing the presentation, when one person is speaking from your team, the other team members need to pay attention to the person who's speaking. No, like looking up at the ceiling, no looking at your notes, no sort of looking around at the audience. You are paying attention to your speaker as a gesture of respect, but also to make it really clear that this is a group effort. And we are attending to each other as a group.